What if the strangest line in the book of Genesis is not the one about a serpent or a forbidden tree, but a quiet sentence about a man who walked east and disappeared into a land no one can find on a map? Genesis 4:16 tells us that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Most people assume Nod is a place, a region with borders, a country that simply faded from human memory. But the Hebrew word behind the name does not describe a country at all. It describes wandering. It describes restlessness. And once we begin to look closely, the verse opens into something much wider than geography. We will follow this story in 3 movements. First, we will let the biblical text speak in its own voice, slowly and without rushing. Then we will turn to the older traditions preserved in the Ethiopian Christian world, where this story is remembered very differently. And finally, we will ask what this forgotten layer of Genesis might still be saying to us now. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The opening chapters of Genesis are written with a strange economy. Whole generations are compressed into a single sentence. Whole worlds are hinted at and then left behind. So when the text pauses to mention Nod, even briefly, the pause itself is worth noticing. The narrator could have left Cain in silence. He could have said only that Cain wandered. Instead, he gives the wandering a name. He gives it a direction, east of Eden. And in the symbolic geography of Genesis, east is never a neutral direction. It is the direction of exile. It is the direction Adam and Eve faced when they were driven from the garden. It is the direction Lot will later choose when he separates from Abraham and drifts towards Sodom. To go east in this book is to move away from the presence of God. Cain does not simply move away. He settles, he builds, he fathers a son, he names a city, and all of this happens in a land whose very name means restlessness. There is a quiet contradiction here that is easy to miss. A wanderer who builds a city, a restless man who lays foundations. The text does not explain the tension, it simply lets it sit, and readers across the centuries have noticed it. Some have read it as irony, others have read it as judgment. But in the older interpretive traditions, especially those preserved in Ethiopian Christianity, the contradiction is read as a clue. Nod, in these traditions, is not only a place, it is a condition. It is what happens to a region of the world when the presence of God withdraws from it. This is where the calm reading of the text begins to deepen. The Bible never says that God abandoned Cain. The mark, whatever it was given to protect him. But Cain leaves. He goes out from the presence of the Lord. The departure is his, not God's. And the land he enters takes its character from that departure. It becomes a place defined by absence. Some scholars suggest that this is why later biblical writers treat the East with such suspicion. The wisdom of the East, the kings of the East, the gardens of the East. They are not always evil, but they are always somehow other. They lie beyond the boundary of covenant. Ethiopian tradition preserves a reading that goes further. In texts such as the Book of Adam and Eve and certain commentaries on Jubilees, Nod is described as a region where the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds is unusually thin. This remains debated, and it is important to say so plainly. The canonical Bible does not describe Nod in these terms, but the Ethiopian readers, working with a wider collection of ancient writings, saw something in the silence of Genesis that troubled them. They saw a place where a man could build a civilization without God, and they asked what kind of help such a civilization would attract. Their answer would shape everything that follows in this story. For now, the canonical text gives us only the outline. A man walks east, a land receives him. A city rises where no city should be. And the narrator of Genesis, who is usually so careful to record the blessings of God on human work, says nothing about blessing here. He simply lets the city stand in silence. That silence is not empty. It is heavy. And the older traditions believe that something filled it, something that had been waiting for a man like Cain to arrive. Chapter 2. The Mark That Was Not a Curse. The mark of Cain is one of the most misunderstood images in the Bible. For centuries, popular imagination has pictured it as a brand of shame, a visible stain on the forehead, a sign that warned others to keep their distance. But the text of Genesis does not describe it that way. When Cain cries out that his punishment is more than he can bear, and that anyone who finds him will kill him, God responds with protection, not further punishment. The Lord set a mark upon Cain, the text says, lest any finding him should kill him. The mark is a shield. It is a sign of mercy laid over the life of a man who has just committed the first murder in human history. This is a strange mercy, and it has troubled readers for a long time. Why protect the murderer? Why give him a sign that guarantees his survival? The canonical text offers no explanation. It simply records the fact, and it is here that interpretive traditions begin to diverge. Western Christianity, especially after the 4th century, tended to read the mark as a symbol of guilt, a kind of moral tattoo. But older readings, including those preserved in Ethiopian sources, understood the mark in a very different way. They saw it as a change in Cain himself, not a brand placed on the outside, but something that happened on the inside. In these older interpretations, the mark altered Cain's perception. It opened something in him. Tradition preserves the idea that after the mark was given, Cain could see what other men could not see. He could sense presences in the air, voices in the wind, movements at the edge of vision. The Ethiopian texts describe this as a kind of spiritual sensitivity, almost an antenna that allowed Cain to perceive beings who normally remained hidden from human awareness. This is not stated in Genesis. It is interpretation, and it must be labeled as such. But it is interpretation that tries to answer a real question raised by the text itself. The question is this: how did Cain, a single man in exile, become the founder of a civilization? In Genesis 4, only a few verses after his banishment, we suddenly read of a city, a wife, a son, and a line of descendants who invent the foundations of human culture. Animal husbandry, music, metalwork, all of it appears in a handful of sentences. The canonical text does not pause to explain how a wandering exile, cut off from the community of his parents, acquired a wife, built a city, and seeded a culture so quickly. The compression is striking, and the Ethiopian readers, sitting with this compression for centuries, came to believe that Cain had help of a kind that no other human had received. The help in their reading came from the Watchers. We will turn to them more closely in the next chapter. For now, it is enough to notice that the mark in this tradition is not only a shield, it is a doorway. It changes what Cain can see, and therefore what Cain can learn. He becomes a student of presences that other men cannot even detect, and this changes the meaning of his exile. He is not simply a man cast out. He is a man set apart in a way that is both protective and dangerous. Some scholars suggest that this reading reflects a much older layer of the Genesis tradition, one that was preserved in Ethiopian Christianity because the Ethiopian canon was never narrowed in the way the Western canon was. Others argue that it represents a later interpretive expansion, perhaps influenced by the Book of Enoch and similar writings. The debate is real, and it is honest to acknowledge it. What is not in dispute is that the canonical text leaves a gap. It tells us that Cain was marked, exiled, and protected. It does not tell us what the mark did. It does not tell us how he built a city. It simply moves on. The silence is the point. The silence is what invites interpretation. And in that silence, the Ethiopian tradition placed a story that tries to explain how the first murderer became the first builder. Not by his own strength alone, not by ordinary human ingenuity, but through a meeting that took place in the land of Nod with beings who had been waiting for him. The canonical text does not confirm this meeting, but it does not deny it either. And the moment we step into the next chapter of the story, we step into the territory where the silence begins to speak. Chapter 3. The Sons of Twilight. The Bible mentions the sons of God only briefly, and almost always with a kind of restraint that suggests the writers knew more than they were willing to say. Genesis 6:2 tells us that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. The sentence is short. The implications are enormous. Who are these sons of God? The canonical text does not define them. Job 1006 uses the same phrase to describe heavenly beings who present themselves before the Lord. Psalm 82 speaks of a divine council. The pattern suggests a category of created beings who exist between God and humanity, beings with awareness, will, and the capacity to choose. In the Book of Enoch, which is canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church but not in most Western traditions, these beings are called watchers. The Hebrew word behind the name carries the sense of those who do not sleep, those who observe. They were, according to this tradition, assigned by God to watch over the early stages of human life. Their role was guardianship, not interference. They were to remain at a distance, to learn, to assist when called, but never to descend into human affairs as participants. The story turns, in Enoch's telling, when some of them refused this restraint. The Ethiopian tradition places the first descent of the watchers in the days of Cain. This is earlier than the more familiar account in Genesis 6, where the sons of God take human wives just before the flood. In the older reading, there were two waves. The first was smaller, more secretive, and centered on Cain. The second was larger, more public, and led directly to the corruption that the flood would wash away. The first wave is the one that concerns us here, and the texts call its members the sons of twilight, because they came at the hour when light and darkness meet, and because their role was meant to be a kind of in-between. What happens, according to this tradition, is that Cain meets them in the land of Nod. He does not summon them, he does not seek them out. The mark on his perception simply allows him to see what was already there, and the watchers in turn recognize in Cain a human who is now visible to them in a way that other humans are not. The meeting is described in the Ethiopian sources as quiet, even gentle. There is no thunder. There is no command. There is only a conversation that begins in the cool of an evening and continues, in one form or another, for generations. The watchers in this reading begin to teach, and the content of their teaching is the heart of the controversy. According to the Book of Enoch, they taught the working of metals, the cutting of stones, the reading of the stars, the mixing of herbs, the meaning of dreams, and the use of certain words for certain effects. None of these skills in themselves are evil. Humanity would eventually develop all of them. The problem in the older reading is not the knowledge itself. The problem is the timing, the source, and the cost. The knowledge was given before humanity was ready for it. It was given by beings who had no authority to give it, and it was given in exchange for something the texts only hint at, a kind of allegiance, a turning of the heart away from the God who had marked Cain in mercy. It is important to say plainly that the canonical Bible does not describe this meeting. The watchers appear by name only in the book of Daniel, where they are called holy ones who descend from heaven with a decree. The fuller story belongs to Enoch, Jubilees, and the Ethiopian commentaries. One historical reading holds that these texts preserve an authentic ancient tradition that the canonical writers chose to summarize rather than expand. Another reading holds that they represent a later imaginative development. The honest answer is that we cannot fully decide between these two views from the evidence we have. What we can do is sit with the question and notice how the canonical text leaves room for it. The room is real. Genesis 4 compresses Cain's descent into civilization into a handful of verses. Genesis 6 opens a door onto a world of sons of God and giants without explaining either. Something is being summarized, something is being held back, and the Ethiopian tradition believed it knew what that something was. It was the story of how the first exiled man met the first rebellious watchers, and how a quiet conversation in a twilight land became the seed of a civilization that the world would later try very hard to forget. Chapter 4. The city that should not have existed. Genesis 4:17 contains one of the strangest sentences in the early chapters of the Bible. Cain knew his wife. The text says, "And she conceived, and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch." In a single verse, a wandering exile becomes a husband, a father, and the founder of the first city named in Scripture. The canonical text does not pause. It does not explain where the wife came from, how the city was planned, or what materials were used. It simply records the fact and moves on. but the speed of the verse is itself a kind of message. Something has changed. The man who was cursed to wander has stopped wandering, and the land of restlessness has, somehow, accepted a foundation. The name of the city is worth noticing. Enoch in Hebrew carries the sense of dedication or initiation. It is the name given to a beginning, to something set apart for a particular purpose. Cain does not name the city after himself, he names it after his son. And in the symbolic logic of Genesis, this is significant. The city is dedicated to the next generation. It is built not only as a shelter, but as an inheritance. Whatever Cain has learned, whatever he has become, he is preparing to pass on. The city is the vessel of that transmission. Ethiopian tradition describes this city in detail that the canonical text does not provide. The descriptions must be received as interpretation, not as historical record, and it is important to say so clearly. But the interpretations are striking. The city in these readings was laid out according to patterns that Cain had learned from the Watchers. Its streets followed the alignments of certain stars. Its central structures were built according to proportions that were said to resonate with unseen forces. The Ethiopian commentators describe a kind of architecture that was meant to do more than shelter the body. It was meant to shape the soul of the one who walked through it. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for many readers, and rightly so. The idea that architecture itself could carry spiritual influence sounds at first like a modern occult fantasy projected back onto the ancient world. But the older tradition is making a different point. It is saying that human beings are formed by the spaces they inhabit. A city built around a temple of the living God shapes its citizens in one direction. A city built around proportions learned from rebellious watchers shapes them in another. The architecture is not magical, it is formational. And the Ethiopian readers believed that the first city of Cain was the first attempt to build a human environment that would form people away from God rather than toward Him. The canonical text gives us only one window into the inner life of this city, and it is the Song of Lamech, found in Genesis 4:23 and 24. Lamech is the seventh from Adam through the line of Cain. He speaks to his two wives in a chant that is both confession and boast. I have slain a man to my wounding, he says, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70-fold and sevenfold. The song is short, but its mood is unmistakable. The reverence that surrounded the mercy given to Cain has hardened in his descendants into pride. The protection has become a slogan, the mark has become a weapon, and the city named for dedication has become, by the seventh generation, a place where killing is celebrated in verse. Some scholars suggest that Lamech's song is the canonical text's quiet way of telling us what life inside the city of Enoch had become. We are not given a description of its streets or its towers. We are given a song, and a song reveals a culture that has lost the fear of God and replaced it with the fear of itself. This is the deeper meaning that begins to emerge here. The city did not need to be described in detail. Its character is shown through the words of one of its grandsons, and those words are enough. The Ethiopian commentators added that the city stood for many generations, and that its influence spread far beyond its walls. They believed that the patterns learned there, the metallurgy, the music, the rituals, traveled with traders and travelers into other regions, slowly preparing the wider world for the larger descent of watchers that would come later. This remains debated, and the canonical Bible does not confirm it. But the canonical text does confirm one thing. By the time we reach Genesis 6, the whole earth is described as corrupt, and the corruption is universal. Something carried it, something spread it, and the older tradition believed it knew where the spreading began. Chapter 5. The four names in the genealogy, Genesis 4:19 through 22, contains a genealogy that most readers pass over quickly. It lists the descendants of Lamech, and it names four children whose roles are described in a single phrase, each. Jabal is called the father of such as dwell in tents and have cattle. Jubal is called the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. Tubal-Cain is called an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and their sister is named Naamah, with no role given at all. The verses are brief. The names are easy to forget, but these 4 names carry the weight of an entire civilization, and the older interpretive traditions treated them as a kind of summary of everything the city of Enoch had become. Jabal is the keeper of livestock and the dweller in tents. On the surface, this seems like a peaceful image. Shepherding is one of the oldest and most honored occupations in the Bible. Abel was a keeper of sheep before Cain killed him. But the text introduces Jabal with a curious phrase. He is not called a shepherd. He is called the father of those who dwell in tents and have cattle. The emphasis is on a way of life, a mobile and accumulating way of life, in which animals are gathered and moved across the land. Tradition preserves the idea that Jabal organized the first systematic herding, the first large-scale management of animal life for human purposes. It was not the gentle shepherding of Abel. It was something more structured, more economic, more focused on increase. Jabal is the father of musicians. He is associated with the harp and the pipe, the stringed and the winged instruments. Music, like architecture, is morally neutral on its surface, but the older tradition believed that the music developed in the city of Enoch was not only artistic, it was functional. It was designed to do something to the listener. The Ethiopian commentators described music that could quiet grief, stir anger, induce trance, or open the mind to suggestion. Tradition preserves the idea that some of this music was used in the rituals taught by the Watchers, and that it was the first attempt to use sound as a tool for shaping the inner state of human beings. This is interpretation, not canonical claim, and it should be held lightly. But it is interpretation that takes seriously the fact that music in the ancient world was never only entertainment. Tubal-Cain is the instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. With him, metallurgy enters the human story. The canonical text presents this without comment. Metal is a tool. Tools are part of civilization, but the older readings recognize that the working of metals is also the foundation of weapons. The same forge that makes a plow makes a sword. The same craft that makes a cup makes a blade, and the Ethiopian tradition believed that the metallurgy taught by Tubal-Cain was inseparable from the knowledge of weapons, and that this knowledge was one of the gifts the Watchers had given. The text does not say this, but the text does name Tubal-Cain in the same passage where it preserves the song of his father Lamech, the song that celebrates killing. The proximity is not accidental, and then there is Naamah. The text gives her no role. She is named, and the verse ends. In a genealogy that carefully assigns a vocation to each of her brothers, her silence is striking. Some scholars suggest that her name, which can mean pleasant or lovely, was enough of a clue for ancient readers, and that her role in the culture of Enoch was understood without being stated. The Ethiopian tradition associated her with the development of certain arts of persuasion and attraction, with the shaping of desire and the management of human attention. This is interpretation, and it remains debated. The canonical text leaves her in silence, but it leaves her in silence at the climax of a list of names that defines a civilization, and silences in Genesis, as we have already seen, are rarely empty. Taken together, the 4 names sketch a complete society. Animals are managed, sound is shaped, metal is forged, desire is cultivated. Each of these is a foundation of human culture, and each of them can be turned toward life or toward harm. The canonical text does not condemn the descendants of Cain for their crafts. It simply lists them, and then immediately tells us about Lamech's song of violence. The juxtaposition is the judgment. The crafts are not the problem. The culture that holds them is the problem. And the older tradition believed that this culture, formed in the city of Enoch, was the first complete human attempt to build a civilization, without reference to the God who had walked with Adam in the garden. The deeper meaning begins to emerge here. Genesis is not telling us that herding is wicked, or that music is dangerous, or that metalwork is corrupt. It is telling us that every gift of culture carries a direction. It can be offered back to God, or it can be turned inward, toward the self, toward power, toward dominance. The 4 names in Lamech's line are the first illustration of the second direction, and the rest of Genesis, in many ways, is the story of what happens when that direction is allowed to spread. Chapter 6. The Giants and the Margins. Genesis 6 opens with one of the most disputed passages in the entire Bible. It is only 4 verses long, but it has generated centuries of commentary, debate, and unease. There were giants in the earth in those days, the text says, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The Hebrew word translated as giants is Nephilim. The phrase sons of God, as we noted earlier, refers in other parts of the Hebrew Bible to heavenly beings, and the verse states, plainly and without apology, that these beings produced children with human women, and that the children were known throughout the ancient world. The canonical text does not explain how this happened. It does not describe the beings in detail. It does not tell us what the children looked like, or how they lived, or what became of them. It simply records the fact and then moves immediately to the announcement of the flood. The narrator seems to assume that his readers already know the story he is summarizing. He gives them the headline, not the full account, and for most of Christian history, especially in the West, the headline was all that survived. The full account, if it existed, was carried elsewhere. In the Ethiopian tradition, the full account is preserved in the Book of Enoch. The book describes a group of 200 watchers who descended on Mount Hermon, bound themselves by oath to a shared rebellion, and took human wives. Their children, the Nephilim, are described as beings of great stature and great hunger. The text says that they consumed the produce of the earth until there was nothing left, and then turned upon humanity and one another. The picture is grim. It is not the picture of mythic heroes. It is the picture of a creation pulled out of balance by a union that was never meant to occur. It is important to handle this material with care. The Book of Enoch is not part of the canonical Bible in most Christian traditions. Its descriptions are vivid, and they have inspired both serious reflection and a great deal of speculation that has gone far beyond what the texts actually say. The honest approach is to recognize that the canonical Genesis preserves the existence of the Nephilim without explaining them, and that Enoch offers an explanation that some traditions accept and others do not. One historical reading holds that Enoch preserves an authentic ancient memory. Another holds that it represents a later attempt to fill in the silence of Genesis 6. The debate is real. The text in front of us is brief. The space around it is wide. What the canonical text does say, however, is striking enough on its own. The Nephilim are described as men of renown. This is not a casual phrase. In the ancient world, renown was tied to story, to memory, to the songs that were sung after a person was gone. To be a man of renown was to be remembered, and the verse implies that the Nephilim were remembered widely, across cultures, across generations. The brief mention in Genesis is a kind of footnote to a much larger memory. The narrator is not introducing the Nephilim. He is reminding his readers of them. This is where the story connects back to the city of Enoch and the land of Nod. If the first wave of watchers came in the time of Cain, as the Ethiopian tradition holds, then the second wave, the larger and more public descent described in Enoch, came into a world that had already been prepared. The patterns of metallurgy, music, ritual, and rebellion had already been established. The watchers who descended in the days of Noah did not arrive in an innocent world. They arrived in a world that had been slowly shaped, generation by generation, by the smaller and quieter influence that had begun in Nod. This remains debated, and the canonical text does not state it directly, but the canonical text does describe a world in which the earth was filled with violence, and in which every imagination of the thoughts of the heart of man was only evil continually. Something had prepared that condition. Something had spread it. The Nephilim, in this reading, are not the cause of the corruption. They are its visible expression. They are the moment when the inner direction of a civilization becomes outwardly impossible to ignore. They are the giants in the margins of the text, mentioned briefly, remembered widely, and then washed away. The canonical Bible does not linger on them. It moves quickly to Noah, and to the ark, and to the rain. But the brief mention is enough to tell us that the world before the flood was not a simple world. It was a world in which the boundary between heaven and earth had been crossed, and in which the consequences of that crossing had become visible in the very bodies of those who walked the land. What follows does not shout for attention. but it changes how the whole story reads. The flood, in the canonical text, is an act of judgment, but it is also an act of mercy. It is the closing of a wound that had been opened generations earlier, in a land called Nod, by a meeting that the text barely mentions. Chapter 7, 2 mountains, 2 bloodlines. After the song of Lamech and the brief naming of Namar, the genealogy of Cain ends. The text does not tell us what became of his line. It simply turns, in Genesis 4:25, to another beginning. Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. The verse explains that Eve saw in Seth a replacement for Abel, the son who had been killed. And then, in the next sentence, the text says something quiet and very important. To Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. This is one of the most easily missed transitions in the early chapters of Genesis. The line of Cain ends with a song of violence. The line of Seth begins with the calling upon the name of the Lord. The contrast is not stated, it is shown. 2 lines emerge from the same first family, and they go in 2 different directions. One builds a city and forges weapons, the other gathers to worship. The text does not announce this as a theme. It simply lets the 2 paths run side by side and trusts the reader to notice. In Ethiopian tradition, the geographical separation of these 2 lines is described in detail. Cain's descendants, according to these readings, remained in the valleys and lowlands of Nod, where the city of Enoch and its surrounding settlements grew. Seth's descendants, by contrast, are said to have lived on the heights of a sacred mountain where they kept the older worship and the older memory. The 2 regions were divided by a long ridge, and for many generations, the 2 lines did not mix. This is interpretation, not canonical claim, and the Bible does not describe these mountains by name. But the interpretation reflects something real in the text. The 2 genealogies of Genesis 4 and Genesis 5 are kept carefully separate. They do not interweave. They are presented as parallel streams flowing in different directions. The line of Seth, traced in Genesis 5, is the line that leads to Noah. It is also the line that includes a figure with a name we have already met. There is a second Enoch in Genesis, and he belongs not to Cain's line, but to Seth's. This second Enoch is described in a way that no other figure in the early genealogies receives. Genesis 5:24 says that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The verse is short. The meaning has been debated for thousands of years, but the contrast with the first Enoch, the city named in Cain's line, could not be more striking. One Enoch is a city built by an exile. The other Enoch is a man who walks with God and is taken. The same name. 2 opposite destinies. The text does not explain the echo. It simply leaves it. In the Ethiopian tradition, the second Enoch is associated with the writings that bear his name. He is presented as the one who received visions of the Watchers, who saw the future of the Nephilim, and who warned his descendants of the judgment that was coming. The canonical Bible mentions him only briefly, but the New Testament book of Jude quotes a prophecy attributed to him, suggesting that even in the 1st century, the wider tradition about Enoch was known and taken seriously by some early Christians. This does not prove the book of Enoch is canonical for all believers. It does show, however, that the figure of Enoch carried weight far beyond the few verses given to him in Genesis. The 2 bloodlines in this reading are not only biological, they are spiritual. They are 2 ways of being human. One way builds, gathers, accumulates, and resists. The other way walks, worships, listens, and waits. The canonical text does not say that everyone in Cain's line was wicked, or that everyone in Seth's line was righteous. It is more subtle than that. It shows us patterns, tendencies, directions, and it shows us that, over time, the 2 patterns began to blur. By the time we reach Genesis 6, the separation has broken down. The sons of God see the daughters of men. The lines mix, and the world that results is the world the flood will end. Some scholars suggest that the breakdown of separation is the deeper cause of the corruption described in Genesis 6, more than the descent of the Watchers itself. The Watchers in this reading could only do what they did because the boundary between the two human lines had already weakened. The sacred mountain had been left, the lowlands had been entered, the worship had been forgotten, and once the boundary was gone, the larger descent could occur. This is interpretation, and it must be held with care, but it is interpretation that takes seriously the slow, quiet work of the chapters between Cain and Noah. The story is not only about giants and angels, it is also about a long, gradual forgetting in which two ways of being human became one, and the one that remained was the one that had drifted furthest from God. And this is where the story becomes harder to ignore. The flood, in the canonical text, is not the punishment of a sudden sin. It is the response to a long erosion. It is what happens when a sacred separation is allowed to dissolve, and when the patterns of Nod are allowed to spread without resistance into every corner of the earth. Many times of Seth's line is not named in Genesis, but the absence of that mountain by the time we reach Noah is felt in every verse. Chapter 8, the pattern that never left the flood ends. The waters recede. Noah steps out onto a washed earth, builds an altar, and offers sacrifice. The canonical text records God's promise that he will not again curse the ground for man's sake, and that seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The world begins again. The line of Seth, narrowed to a single family, becomes the trunk from which all later humanity will grow. The land of Nod is not mentioned again by name. The city of Enoch is gone. The Watchers, according to the book of Enoch, are bound in a place of darkness until the day of judgment. And yet, the story does not feel finished. The canonical Bible itself acknowledges this. By Genesis 10, the sons of Noah have already begun to scatter, and by Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel is rising on the plain of Shinar. Something has survived. Something has been carried through. This is where the older tradition and the canonical text agree in a quiet way. Neither suggests that the flood erased the pattern of Nod. Both suggest that the pattern returned in new forms almost immediately. The Tower of Babel is not a city of giants. It is a city of unified ambition, built by people who say, "Let us make us a name." The phrase echoes the description of the Nephilim as men of renown. The desire for a name, for a memory that does not depend on God, is the same desire that animated the first city of Enoch. The form is different, the direction is the same. This is the deeper claim of the older interpretive tradition, and it is a claim that the canonical text supports more than many readers notice. Nod, in this reading, is not only a place that existed once, it is a pattern that recurs. Wherever human beings gather knowledge, skill, and power apart from the God who gave them the capacity for all three, the pattern reappears. The architecture changes. The music changes. The mittals change. But the inward direction, the turning of the heart towards self-exaltation, remains the same. The canonical Bible names this direction in many ways: pride, idolatry, the fear of man rather than the fear of God. The older traditions simply give it a geography. They call it Nod. It is tempting at this point to draw direct lines between the ancient story and the modern world. The Ethiopian commentators of earlier centuries had no knowledge of the technologies we know today. They did not anticipate the specific debates about genetic modification, artificial intelligence, or the merging of human consciousness with machines. To project our concerns directly onto their texts would be to misuse them, but the older readings do offer something quieter and more durable than prediction. They offer a way of recognizing a pattern. They suggest that whenever a civilization begins to treat the limits of human nature as obstacles to be overcome by hidden knowledge, rather than as gifts to be received with humility, it is walking in a direction that the Bible has already mapped. This remains debated, and reasonable readers will disagree about how closely the map fits any particular moment in history. But the map itself is ancient. If this reflection stays with you, you can share your thoughts below, in your own words, in your own time. The older tradition was never meant to produce alarm. It was meant to produce attention, and attention in the biblical sense, is the slow practice of noticing where the heart is being formed and by what. The canonical text closes the story of Cain and his line without bitterness. It does not curse the descendants of Nod by name. It simply moves on and lets the line of Seth carry the promise forward. The promise itself is small at first. A man who walks with God and is taken. A man who builds an ark and is saved. A man who leaves his country and follows a voice into a land he does not know. Each step of the promise is quiet. None of it shouts. None of it competes with the renown of the men of old. And yet, the line of the promise is the line that endures. This is, in the end, the gentle counterweight that the older tradition placed against the loud memory of Nod. The city of Enoch was famous in its time. Its crafts spread. Its songs traveled. Its name was carried by traders and travelers far beyond its walls. And yet, by the time the canonical text reaches the patriarchs, the city is gone. No ruin is named. No location is preserved. The famous have been forgotten, and the quiet have been remungered. The men of renown have left no descendants we can trace. The man who walked with God has left a name that is still spoken. There is something in this reversal that the older tradition wanted its readers to feel, slowly, without being told. The pattern of Nod is loud. It builds quickly. It accumulates. It impresses. The pattern of Seth is quiet. It walks. It worships. It waits. In any given generation, the loud pattern looks stronger. It seems to be winning. Its cities rise. Its songs spread. Its names are known. But over the long arc of the biblical story, the quiet pattern is the one that endures. The flood does not end the loud pattern, but it limits it. The promise to Abraham does not silence it, but it sets a different center. The coming of the Messiah in the larger Christian reading does not erase it, but it begins to undo it from within. And so the land of Nod in this older reading is not finally a place on a map. It is a question asked of every generation. Where is the heart being formed? By what knowledge? In whose presence? The canonical Bible does not answer the question for us. It simply tells the story and trusts us to listen. The Ethiopian tradition fills in some of the silences and asks us to weigh what it offers with care. Between the two, a fuller picture emerges. Not a picture of conspiracy, not a picture of hidden truths that some elite is trying to suppress, but a picture of a long, patient struggle inside human history, between two ways of being human, one way that builds in restlessness and one way that walks in trust. The story of Nod is not, in the end, a story about giants or angels or forbidden crafts. It is a story about the slow shaping of the human heart, and about the God who, even in exile, places a mark of mercy on the one who has wandered furthest. The mark protects. The mark does not condemn, and the older readers sitting with this text for many centuries believe that the mark is still being offered, in different forms, in every generation, to those who recognize the pattern of Nod in themselves, and who turn quietly toward the older mountain, where men once began to call upon the name of the Lord.